The second rocking chair sat empty on Louis Haskins's porch for 3 weeks before anyone in Caldwell, Kansas even noticed it was there. And by the time they did, the whole town had an opinion about who ought to be sitting in it. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell was a cattle town that smelled of dust and ambition, perched right on the Kansas-Indian Territory border like a man leaning too far over a fence. The Kishom Trail ran through it like a vein of gold, bringing longhorn cattle and Texas cowboys and trouble in roughly equal proportions every season. Louis Haskins had been in Caldwell for 4 years by then, and in that time he had built himself a solid reputation and a solid house, which was more than most men managed in a place where permanence was considered either a virtue or a foolishness depending on who you asked. Louis was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were rough from carpentry and a jaw that carried a few days of stubble more often than not. He had come to Caldwell from Missouri with a wagon full of tools and a determination to build things rather than tear them down. He had started small, fixing fence posts and barn doors for the ranchers outside of town, and then he had won the contract to help construct the New Leland Hotel on Main Street, and after that the work had come steadily. He owned a modest house on the eastern edge of town, far enough from the saloons that he could sleep at night, close enough to everything that he could walk to work in the morning without trouble. He had built the house himself, of course. Every board of it was cut to his specification, every joint fitted with the kind of care that made older carpenters shake their heads in something between admiration and annoyance. The porch stretched across the full front of the house, wide and solid, with a good overhang that kept the rain off and made the evenings bearable even when the summer heat lingered past sundown. He had built one rocking chair for it the first year, just for himself, and for 3 years that single chair had sat there and held him through long evenings of thinking, which he did a considerable amount of. Then in September of 1878, he had gone out to his workshop one Saturday morning and built a second chair. He had not planned to do it. He had walked in meaning to repair a cabinet for the widow Horton on Cheyenne Street, and somewhere between picking up his tools and setting them down again the second rocking chair had happened. He had shaped the runners with extra attention, had sanded the arms until they were smooth as polished bone, had fitted the back slats with a slight curve that made sitting in it not just comfortable but restful in a way that the word comfortable could not quite contain. When he carried it out to the porch and set it beside his own chair, he stood back and looked at the two of them sitting there side by side in the afternoon light, and he felt something he could not entirely name. He did not invite anyone to sit in it. Not that first day, not that first week. When Harlan Briggs from the hardware store came by to settle an account and saw the two chairs, he raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which from Harlan was practically a full sermon. When Louis's friend and sometime drinking companion, Cyrus Dodd, spotted the chairs from the road and called up to the porch asking who the second one was for, Louis said he had built it to sell, which was a lie so obvious that Cyrus had the decency not to laugh until he was around the corner. The truth was that Louis had built the chair with someone specific in mind, even if he had not admitted that to himself right away. The truth had a name. The name was Eliza Walker. Eliza Walker had arrived in Caldwell 6 weeks before the chair was built, in late July, on the southbound stage from Wichita. She had stepped down from that coach with a large trunk, a small carpet bag, a set of botanical illustrations rolled in a leather case, and an expression that suggested she had thought very carefully about coming to this town and was now reserving judgment on whether she had been right. She was 27 years old, with dark hair pinned up under a straw hat that had seen better days, and brown eyes that missed nothing, and a way of looking at things, buildings and people and the flat Kansas sky alike, as if she were deciding whether they measured up to some standard she carried inside her. She had come to Caldwell to teach. The town had been trying to hire a schoolteacher for 2 years, cycling through a series of young men from the East who lasted one winter, and a couple of near misses with women who had decided on marriage before they ever got off the stage. Eliza had answered the advertisement in the Wichita paper with a letter that was so direct and so free of the usual flattering preambles that the school board had hired her almost entirely on the strength of its confidence. She had been teaching in Wichita for 3 years before that, and before Wichita she had been in Lawrence, and before Lawrence she had been in Ohio, where she was born and raised, and from which she had departed at the age of 22 with a teaching certificate and a belief that the West had more need of what she had to offer than the East did. Her first month in Caldwell was occupied entirely with the school. The building was a single room on the north end of town, and it needed work. The previous teacher, a 20-year-old from Pennsylvania who had lasted 11 months, had left it in a state of organizational collapse that Eliza addressed with the same efficient determination she brought to everything. She cleaned, she sorted, she cataloged the books, she mended the desks, she wrote to the school board with a list of supplies that needed to be ordered and a deadline by which they needed to arrive. The board, accustomed to teachers who requested things in a tentative manner and then forgot about them, found her somewhat alarming and mostly complied. Louis had seen her for the first time in the general store run by Warren Dodd, Cyrus's father, in the first week of August. She had been standing at the counter with a list in her hand, going through it item by item with a methodical attention that suggested she had learned through experience that if you did not verify things yourself, they did not get done correctly. He had been waiting his turn to pick up a barrel of nails, and he had watched her without meaning to, noting the way she tilted her head slightly when she listened to Warren's response to a question, noting the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when it escaped the pin, noting that when she smiled at something Warren said the whole expression changed her face in a way that seemed to take both of them by surprise. He had introduced himself that day, briefly and without particular distinction, and she had nodded and said she was pleased to meet him, and that had been the end of it for several weeks. They had encountered each other in the way that people in small towns inevitably did, at Sunday services and at the hardware store and on the main street, and each time they had exchanged the pleasantries of acquaintanceship with a politeness that did not indicate much. But there had been the afternoon in late August when a thunderstorm had come up suddenly and caught them both outside the post office at the same time, and they had stood together under the post office's narrow awning for 20 minutes while the rain came down in curtains and turned the main street into a river of mud. In those 20 minutes they had talked, properly talked, in the way that is only possible when the weather has removed the option of polite escape. She had told him about the school and what she was trying to do with it. He had told her about the hotel construction and how the front facade was giving him trouble because the client wanted something that looked Eastern but had to withstand Kansas weather, which was essentially a disagreement between two different philosophies of architecture. She had laughed at that and asked what his own philosophy was, and he had said he built things to last, which he had meant as a straightforward statement about carpentry, but which had come out sounding like something more, and they had both noticed that it had. And then the rain had stopped and they had gone their separate ways, and Louis had walked home thinking about it for the rest of the evening. He had built the second rocking chair 2 weeks after that. He had not analyzed the connection at the time, but he was aware of it. The school opened in September with 23 students between the ages of 6 and 14, a range that would have terrified most teachers, but which Eliza handled with a structured rotation system that she had developed during her time in Wichita. She grouped the older students as teaching assistants for the younger ones on certain mornings, which both accelerated the older students' own understanding and freed her to work intensively with the children who were falling behind. Louis heard about this from Cyrus, whose youngest nephew was one of Eliza's students, and the hearing of it produced in him a complicated feeling that was admiration with something warmer running under it. October came with its gold light and its cooling evenings, and the second rocking chair continued to sit empty on Louis's porch. He knew, in the way that a man knows things he has not yet had the courage to act on, that he needed to speak to Eliza Walker with some kind of purpose, and not just the accidental proximity that had characterized their acquaintance so far. The problem was that he could not determine with any confidence whether she had any interest in him beyond the courteous acknowledgment she extended to most people in the town. She was not unfriendly. She was simply contained, self-possessed in a way that made it difficult to read the temperature beneath the surface. The occasion presented itself, as occasions often do, through someone else's need. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October when Louis was walking past the school after delivering some timber to the church across the road, and he heard a sound from inside the building that was not a classroom sound. It was the sound of someone having a real argument, not the scrapping of children but the low, urgent argument of adults, and it was coming through the closed door with enough heat behind it that he stopped walking. He was not a man who put himself into other people's business without cause, but something about the tone made him hesitate on the step, and then the door opened and a man came out, nearly walking into Louis on the narrow step. It was Rance Mallory, which told Louis immediately that things were more complicated than a simple dispute. Rance Mallory was the elder son of a cattle rancher whose land sat to the southwest of Caldwell, and he was 28 years old and broadly built and possessed of a certainty about his own importance that came from having had that importance confirmed for most of his life. He stopped when he nearly collided with Louis and straightened himself, and gave Louis a look that was meant to suggest that whatever Louis had heard was no concern of his. "Mallory," Louis said, because something had to be said. "Haskins," Rance said, and then he went down the steps and walked away with the particular stride of a man who has just lost an argument and is pretending he chose to end it. Louis knocked on the open door. Eliza was standing at the front of the schoolroom with her back to him, one hand braced on the edge of a desk, and when she turned around she had the look of someone who had been angry and was in the process of converting that anger into something more useful. A small flush still sat in her cheeks. "I heard some of that," Louis said, because she would know from his face that he had, and he did not see the use of pretending otherwise. "I was passing. I am not in the habit of listening at doors." "I know you are not," she said, and the directness of her certainty about that, the simple assumption of his decency, did something to him that he could not immediately sort out. "Is there anything you need?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "He wants the school to move the teaching of the older boys to a different schedule so they can work cattle drives through October and November. The board is inclined to let him have his way because his father has money and money in this town has weight, and you are not inclined to let him have it. What I am inclined toward," she said, "is having children in school when school is in session, which is not a revolutionary position." "No," Louis agreed, "it is not." She looked at him again, that tilted head listening look he had noticed the first day. "Do you know the school board members well?" "I have built things for most of them," he said. Something shifted in her expression, not calculation exactly, more like a problem being turned over to find the right angle. "I have a meeting with them next Thursday," she said. "I would appreciate it if you would come." He said he would come. He said it more quickly than was probably dignified, and she thanked him with a gravity that suggested she was aware of what she was asking and did not take it lightly. He walked home that afternoon with the feeling of a man who has just been given a clear direction after a long time of uncertain wandering. The school board meeting was held in the back room of Warren Dodd's general store on a Thursday evening, with 4 men seated behind a table that was too wide for the room, giving the whole arrangement the slightly absurd formality of a court convened in a pantry. Eliza arrived with her attendance records and her curriculum notes, and a written argument for her position that she had clearly prepared with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Louis sat against the wall and said nothing for the first half hour while the board members made their considerations known, most of which boiled down to not wanting to antagonize the Mallory family. Then Eliza finished speaking, and one of the board members, a man named Frost who ran the town's only newspaper, said with the kind of gentleness men use when they are being condescending, that perhaps Miss Walker did not fully understand how a cattle economy worked, and that some accommodation of the seasonal realities was simply practical. Louis stood up. He had not planned to. He did it with the instinct of someone who has heard something unfair and cannot remain seated in its presence. "With respect," he said, "I think what you are describing is asking the schoolteacher to give up the integrity of her term so that a rancher's cattle drive schedule is not inconvenienced. The Mallory Ranch has enough hired hands that the Mallory boys being in school through November is not going to strand any cattle on any trail. What it is going to do is keep those boys in school long enough to learn to read a contract before they sign one, which, given what I have seen of cattle contracts, might be the most useful thing anyone could do for their long-term welfare." There was a silence. Frost looked at him. Warren Dodd, who liked Louis and had a fine sense of which way things were moving, covered a smile with his hand. The board voted to maintain the school schedule as written. It was not a unanimous vote, but it was a majority, and it held. Outside afterward, walking under the cold stars of the October night, Eliza said to him, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "Frost is going to be difficult about your next building permit." "Frost is always difficult about everything," Louis said. "I have survived him before." She stopped walking. They were on the main street, and the light from the saloon down the road cast a warm yellow stripe across the dust, and she turned to look at him with an expression that he could not fully read in the dim light, but that was serious and direct and free of the usual social coding. "Why did you come?" she asked. "The honest reason." He thought about the second rocking chair sitting empty on his porch. He thought about the 20 minutes in the rain outside the post office. He thought about the feeling of recognizing someone the way you recognize a landscape you have never seen before, but that matches something you have been carrying inside you. "Because I wanted to," he said. "Because you asked. Because what Frost said was wrong. Because I find myself more interested in your opinion of me than I have any sensible reason to be after 6 weeks of acquaintance." He stopped because he was about to say something about the rocking chair that would either make perfect sense or sound entirely deranged, and he had not yet determined which. "Because it seemed right," he finished, which was both the most and the least of it. She was quiet for a moment. "That is an honest answer," she said. "You asked for one." "I did," she said. And then, in the manner of someone putting a bookmark in a conversation, "I should get home. It is cold tonight." He walked her back to the boarding house on Chestnut Street where she rented a room, and at the gate she thanked him again, and he said good night, and he walked home feeling as though he were carrying something fragile and important and had not yet decided where to set it down. November came in cold and serious. The cattle season was ending, and the Texas cowboys who had been moving through all summer were heading back south, leaving Caldwell quieter and somehow more itself, the town reduced to its permanent residents and their ordinary lives. The school continued, and Louis found reasons, more reasons than strictly existed, to walk past it during the day. He was not proud of this, but he was not entirely ashamed of it either. Twice, he stopped and repaired things without being asked. Once a hinge on the school door that had been complaining loudly enough to disrupt lessons, and once a loose board in the step that could have sent a child headlong into the dirt. Both times Eliza thanked him with the same serious directness she brought to everything, and both times she offered him coffee in the small room off the classroom that served as her preparation space, and both times he stayed longer than the repair warranted and left feeling as if the temperature of everything had been raised a few degrees in a way that was not unpleasant. He began to find that she surprised him regularly, which was not a quality he had expected, and which he valued more highly than he had known he would. She had opinions about architecture, arrived at from her reading rather than any professional knowledge, but argued with a precision that made him reconsider his own assumptions. She had a dry wit that revealed itself slowly, like something that had to be earned, and when it appeared it was so well aimed that the only honest response was laughter. She was unsentimental about the difficulties of frontier life in a way that was not hardness but clarity, the difference between a woman who had never expected ease and a woman who had decided not to require it. He was, by the middle of November, thoroughly and helplessly in love with her, a condition he had not experienced before with anything like this particular quality of completeness, as if every previous feeling he had carried had been a sketch, and this was the finished work. He had not told her this. He had not told anyone this, although Cyrus had looked at him twice over their drinks at the Leland Hotel's bar with an expression of resigned comprehension that suggested his condition was apparent to people who were paying attention. What stopped him was not uncertainty about his own feelings. What stopped him was that he genuinely could not tell what she wanted from her life, and he was too respectful of her to assume that what she wanted included him. She had come to Caldwell with a purpose and an independence that was not a pose but a real organizing principle of how she lived. He did not want to be the man who stood between a woman and her purpose. He had seen that done, and it had never ended well for anyone. What he needed, he thought, sitting in his own rocking chair on the porch on a cold November evening with the second chair empty beside him, was a way to make his feelings known without making them a demand. He needed to offer something and let her decide about it, which was both the simplest and the most difficult thing in the world. He had been sitting with this problem for several evenings when something happened that cut through all of it and made the philosophical consideration beside the point. It was a Saturday afternoon in late November, and Eliza was not at the school because there was no school on Saturdays, and Louis was at his workshop finishing a cabinet when Cyrus appeared at the workshop door breathing hard from having walked fast, and said that Rance Mallory and 2 of his men were at the boarding house, and had been there for an hour, and the woman who ran it, old Mrs. Flanders, had sent her grandson to find someone responsible because the situation was not comfortable. Louis put down his tools. He did not run. He walked quickly and with a purpose, which was a different thing, and when he arrived at the boarding house, he found the situation to be exactly what concerned Mrs. Flanders had implied it was. Rance Mallory and 2 cowboys from the Mallory Ranch were in the front parlor of the boarding house, and Eliza was standing by the parlor window with the particular posture of someone who has decided that retreat is not available as an option and has organized themselves accordingly. She was not frightened, or if she was, she had placed it somewhere it was not visible. She was angry, and the anger was cold and controlled and rather impressive. Rance, for his part, appeared to have come with the intention of persuading Eliza to reconsider her position on the school schedule, which was the stated reason, and also with the secondary intention that was not stated, but was evident enough in the way he occupied the room. He was not threatening in a direct way. He was threatening in the way that men who have always had the advantage of size and family name are threatening, through the simple fact of their presence and their refusal to acknowledge that their presence might not be welcome. Louis came through the door and looked at the room and said, simply, "Miss Walker, I believe you had an appointment." She looked at him across the room. Something in her eyes registered and went still, the way a tightly wound thing goes still when the pressure on it is released. "I did," she said. "I had quite forgot." She picked up her coat from the chair with deliberate calm. Rance turned. "Haskins." "Mallory," Louis said. "I think you have probably said what you came to say. The school schedule will stand. The board has voted. Coming here to put pressure on the schoolteacher is the kind of thing that tends to get into the newspaper, and your father, from what I understand, is running for county commissioner next year." That last part was a risk. It was the right kind of risk. Rance Mallory had a temper, but he had also been raised by a calculating father, and the mention of the commissioner race was a reminder that the calculating father would have a view about what was happening in this parlor if it got out. The calculation lasted about 3 seconds, And then Rance nodded with the rigid dignity of someone who has decided to retreat and intends to make it look like a choice. And he and his men left, and the front door of the boarding house clicked shut behind them. Mrs. Flanders appeared from behind the kitchen door with the speed of someone who had been listening through it and put a hand over her heart and said she needed to sit down. Eliza put on her coat. Her hands were steady. Louis watched them for the slight tremor that would have indicated what the posture had been covering and saw nothing, which meant either that she was genuinely unshaken or that her self-command was absolute, and he was not entirely sure which of those possibilities impressed him more. "Come for a walk," he said. "The cold air will do better than sitting here." She came. They walked north along the edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the prairie opened up, brown and wide and enormous in the November light. The sky above it that particular shade of pale blue that comes only in late autumn on the plains, clear and cold and endless. They walked for a while without talking, which felt right, the silence of two people who have just shared something and do not need to fill the space between them. Finally she said, "He is not going to stop." "No," Louis agreed. "Probably not right away, but Caldwell is a town with laws and a future. His father knows that. Rance will be managed by his father's ambition even if not by his own sense. You knew about the commissioner race." "Small towns talk," he said. "I listen." She looked sideways at him as they walked. "You have a habit of arriving when things need arriving at," she said. "The post office, the school board meeting today." "I live here," he said. "I tend to be around." "That is not what I am describing." He was quiet for a moment, watching the flat line of the horizon where the last of the autumn grass met the sky. "I pay attention," he said, "to things that matter to me." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood facing the open prairie with the wind coming off it, cold and direct, carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. "Louis," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name, and they both registered it. "Yes," he said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, the way you answered me outside the store board meeting." "All right," he said. "What is it that you want from this, from whatever this is?" She made a small gesture that included the space between them, the walking, the 3 months of accidental proximity that had not been entirely accidental. He turned to look at her. The wind was lifting a strand of her hair against her cheek, and she had not pushed it away, and the pale light was on her face, and he thought that there was no version of his life that he could imagine with any pleasure that did not have her in it. "I want to know you," he said. "I want to spend time in your company. I want to hear what you think about things, because you think about things in a way that makes me reconsider what I think, which is not something that happens to me often." He paused. "I built a second rocking chair for my porch in September. I have not been able to invite anyone to sit in it because the only person I built it for is you, and I did not know how to say that without it sounding like more pressure when what I want to offer is the opposite of that. An invitation. Something open. Something you can say no to without it changing anything between us that you might want to keep." She was very still while he said this. When he finished, she was still for a long moment, and the wind moved between them, and the prairie stretched out to the edge of everything. Then she said, "Show me this chair." They walked back through town to his house on the eastern edge, and he led her up the porch steps, and there were the 2 chairs, side by side in the cold afternoon light, the second one with its smoothed arms and its careful joinery, slightly more elegant than his own, which was a detail she noticed. "You built it better than yours," she said. "I had more practice by then," he said, and then, "That is not entirely the reason." She sat down in it. She sat down carefully, the way you sit in something you are deciding about, and then she settled back against the slightly curved slats, and the chair held her perfectly, which it would because he had built it that way without entirely knowing why. She looked out at the street from his porch and at the brown November yard and at the bare branches of the cottonwood at the fence line. "It fits well," she said. "I am glad," he said, and sat down in his own chair beside her, and they sat there together in the cold afternoon for a long time, talking sometimes and quiet sometimes. And at some point the silence became completely comfortable, and that was when he knew, with a clarity that was like a door opening into a room full of light, that whatever he had been hoping for was already beginning. The weeks that followed had the quality of a thing that is both new and somehow inevitable, as if it had always been moving in this direction, and only needed the right moment to declare itself. They began to take Sunday afternoon walks that were not coincidental, planned openly, and with a mutual acknowledgement that made both of them quietly glad. They had dinner together at the Leland Hotel's dining room, which was the respectable establishment in Caldwell for such occasions, and afterward they walked and talked until the cold drove them inside. He came to sit on the porch with her on the evenings when the temperature permitted, and she brought books sometimes, and they read their own things side by side with a companionable silence that was as satisfying as conversation. He learned things about her that were sometimes surprising and always interesting. She had left Ohio not only because of the teaching opportunity, but because of a man, an engagement that had ended badly in her 21st year, a man who had been charming and attentive during the courtship, and had turned, once the understanding was reached, into someone who expected her to become smaller to accommodate his larger opinion of himself. She told Louis this one evening on the porch without drama, as a piece of factual history, but he understood that it was also an explanation of why she was careful, why she kept her self-possession close, why she needed to know that what she was offered was an invitation and not a trap made to look like one. He told her things in return, things he had not told many people. He told her about his father, a cold and exacting man in Missouri who had managed to communicate his standards without ever communicating any warmth, and how Louis had understood as a young man that the way to be free of that coldness was to build something, because a thing you built was yours in a way that nothing inherited could be. He told her about the years before Caldwell, the drifting years, following work from town to town, sleeping in whatever accommodation was available, and how it had taught him to value the having of a place more than people who had always had one could understand. She listened with the full attention she brought to things that mattered, which was one of the qualities he loved most in her, this ability to be completely present with what someone was saying. Most people listened with half their mind on what they intended to say next. Eliza listened as if the thing being said was the most important thing in the room. December arrived, and with it the first serious snow, which Caldwell received in early December as a gift and a problem in equal measure. The main street became a pale and quiet version of itself, and the children walked to school in it like small, serious soldiers. And Eliza instituted something she called a reading afternoon on the particularly cold days, where the older students read aloud to the younger ones, in a rotation that she had designed to be both educational and, as Louis noted when she explained it to him, rather beautiful in its human architecture. He asked her, on a cold December evening when they were both on the porch with blankets despite the temperature, because they had decided that the cold was an inadequate reason to give up the chairs, whether she was happy in Caldwell. It was a direct question, and he meant it directly, because he needed to know whether what was growing between them was growing in a place that she had chosen and would continue to choose, or whether it was growing in a place she was merely passing through. She thought about it in the way she thought about things that deserved real consideration rather than a quick answer. "I am happier here than I expected to be," she said finally, which is not the same as saying I expected not to be happy. I expected the school to be challenging, and it is, but it is challenging in ways I understand. What I did not expect was the rest of it. "What is the rest of it?" he asked. She looked at him sideways from her chair, and the lamp light from inside the house came through the window and touched the side of her face. "You," she said, with the directness that he had come to understand was both her nature and a form of courage. "This, the porch, the evenings, a pause, the fact that you built a chair that fits me before you had ever spoken to me properly. I did not know it was for you when I built it," he said, not consciously, and now I cannot imagine it being for anyone else." She nodded, that slow nod of someone receiving information they have been waiting for, and finding that it is what they thought it would be. "Then I am happy," she said. "Not only because of this, also because of the school and the work and the town, but yes, I am happy." He reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand out, palm up, an offering, and she looked at it for a moment and then put her hand in his. And they sat like that in the cold December evening with the snow on the ground and the stars hard and bright above Kansas. And Louis Haskins thought that he had built a number of things in his life, some of them quite fine, and that none of them had the feeling of rightness that this had. Christmas came to Caldwell with the particular brightness of celebrations in hard places, where the effort put into the holiday is in direct proportion to the difficulty of the year that has preceded it. The school held a presentation that Eliza had spent 2 weeks preparing, which involved the older students performing a reading and the younger ones singing, and which was attended by most of the town, and which produced in the assembled parents a pride in their children that was partly deserved and partly manufactured by Eliza's skill in making each child appear to be doing better than they were, which Louis considered one of the kindest forms of teaching. He sat near the back of the room and watched her manage the whole occasion with the quiet competence of someone who had prepared for everything, and felt the same sensation he always felt watching her work, which was a combination of admiration and something more tender that he had no single word for. Afterward there was a gathering at the church hall with food that the town's women had collectively produced, and there was music. A fiddle and a banjo played by 2 cowboys who had stayed in Caldwell through the winter rather than heading south, and there was dancing of the informal frontier variety, where the steps mattered less than the willingness and the energy. Louis danced with Eliza twice, which was within the bounds of what propriety allowed for an unmarried couple in 1878, and the second dance was slow enough that he was aware of her nearness, and of the warmth of her hand in his, and of the fact that she danced with her eyes open and occasionally on his, not with the lowered gaze of shyness, but with the direct attention that was distinctly hers. After the second dance he said quietly, near her ear so that the fiddle music would not drown him out, "I would like to talk to you about something. Not tonight, when things are quieter." She leaned back slightly to look at his face, and then she said, "All right," with a steadiness that told him she had a reasonable idea of what the something was. The conversation happened 3 days after Christmas, on the porch, in the pale cold of a late December afternoon when the world was white and still, and even the distant sound of the saloon seemed to be holding its breath. He had thought about how to begin it and had decided that he was not capable of the kind of elaborate preparation that the occasion perhaps warranted, and that the best thing he could do was simply tell the truth. He said, "I love you. I have been in love with you since sometime in August, which I am aware is both earlier than a reasonable man would admit to and too late in the year for me to have stopped it even if I had tried. I am not asking you to feel the same thing. I am not asking you to decide anything right now. I only wanted you to know because I find that keeping it to myself is becoming a form of dishonesty, and I do not want to be dishonest with you." She had been looking at the street while he talked. When he stopped, she turned and looked at him fully, and her expression had the quality of a landscape after rain, cleared of everything peripheral and very present. "Louis," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you too." She said it with the same directness she brought to everything. "I have been for some time. I was not certain of it until recently, and when I was certain of it I was not sure what to do with it, given the situation, given what I told you about Ohio, but I am certain now." He let out a breath that he had not entirely known he was holding. "All right," he said, which was not remotely adequate and which she seemed to understand was the best he could do with the size of it. "Yes," she said, "all right." They sat together on the porch in the December cold, and the chairs creaked softly with the small movements of people who have just said something large, and are letting it settle into the shape of the world around them. and the cottonwood in the yard had ice on its branches that caught the pale winter light and threw it in small bright pieces across the snow. And Louis Haskins thought that he had been a man who built things. And now, he was a man who had something more valuable than anything he had built, which was a home that was not only walls and roof and porch, but the presence of another person who had chosen it. January of 1879 came in hard and bright, and with it came several things that altered the shape of things considerably. The first was that Cyrus Dodd, who had been watching Louis's progress with Eliza with the kind of fond exasperation reserved for friends who take a very long time to do obvious things, appeared at Louis's door on a January morning with a face that combined congratulation and news in a complicated way. "I am glad for you," Cyrus said, before Louis had even asked what brought him. "And before you ask how I know, my father's store is where everyone talks and misses. Flanders mentioned that you and the schoolteacher had been keeping company in a serious way, and most of the town is glad about it even if they are pretending to mind their own business." "The town minds everyone's business," Louis said, without particular objection. "The town likes Miss Walker," Cyrus said. "After that school presentation at Christmas, there is not a parent in Caldwell who does not think she is about the best thing to come down the stage road in years. Which brings me to the other part." The other part was that the school board, led by Frost, who had apparently had a change of direction on the subject of Eliza Walker, was considering the question of the school's future in a more serious way. There was talk of building a proper school building, something larger, with a real teacher's room and storage, and possibly a second classroom if enrollment continued to grow. Frost had been asking around about what it would cost to build it, and someone, unsurprisingly, had given him Louis's name. Louis met with Frost on a Friday morning in Frost's newspaper office, where the smell of ink was so thick you could almost chew it. Frost was a lean man of 50, with the manner of someone who had spent a long time deciding what the truth was, and had eventually decided it was whatever was useful. He had not warmed to Louis after the school board meeting in October, but he was a practical man, and he acknowledged over coffee that Haskins did good work, and that building the new school properly was more important than any residual discomfort. Louis took the contract. It was a good contract, and the work was work he believed in, which made the combination satisfying in a way that pure business calculations never quite managed. He told Eliza about it that evening on the porch, where they now sat as a matter of established habit, wrapped against the January cold. Her face when he told her was the face of someone receiving information that makes an abstract hope into a concrete reality, and she said, with the plainness that could express what other people needed entire speeches for, "That will be a good thing for the children." "That is why I took it," he said. "Is it?" she said, with a small, dry quality that was her version of teasing him. "Among the reasons," he agreed. The winter continued. Louis worked on the school building plans between his other projects, bringing them to Eliza to review, which was technically unnecessary but which produced conversations of a quality that justified the practice. She had thoughts about the placement of windows relative to the morning light, and about the height of the ceiling relative to acoustics, neither of which he had told her to think about, and both of which he incorporated into the design and which genuinely improved it. Rance Mallory was not entirely gone from the picture, which was predictable. He appeared at the school once more in February, and this time Louis was not there when it happened, and Eliza handled it herself with a composure that left Rance with very little ground to stand on, and which she told Louis about afterward with a precision that suggested she had been both prepared for it and somewhat satisfied by how it had gone. His father, running his commissioner campaign with a new attentiveness to public opinion, had apparently had a word with him about the school situation, and after February, the Mallory presence in Eliza's professional life diminished to a sullen distance that was manageable. February also brought a letter, which Eliza mentioned one evening with a carefulness that told him the letter was significant. It was from the school board in Wichita, offering her a position there, a larger school, more students, better facilities, and higher pay. He did not ask her what she intended to do about it. He waited, because she deserved the time to think about it without his preferences pressing on the thinking, and because he had said what his feelings were, and she knew them, and adding more would be applying a weight she had specifically said she did not want applied. She was quiet about it for 4 days, and in those 4 days he went through the full range of what he was capable of thinking, and came out on the other side of it with a resigned love that said, "If she goes, I will be glad for what I have had, and I will not spend the rest of my life resenting her for knowing what she needed." He believed this. It cost him considerably to believe it, but he did. On the 4th day she came to the porch in the late afternoon with the letter in her hand and sat down in her chair and said, "I am going to decline it." He let out a long breath. "Why?" "Because I am building something here," she said. "The school is getting its new building. The children here need what I am doing, and I have only started doing it. And because," she paused, and in the pause was everything, "I would be leaving the only place I have ever felt that my work and my life were in the same direction." He looked at her. "The same direction," he repeated. "Yes," she said. She met his eyes with her particular straightforwardness. "I am not declining it only for you. I want you to know that. I am declining it because Caldwell is where I want to be, which includes you but is larger than you. I need you to understand that distinction." "I understand it," he said. "I am glad of it." She nodded. "Good," she said, and settled back in the chair with the satisfied air of someone who has thought a thing through and found the ground under it solid. March came and the ground began to soften, and Louis broke ground on the new school building. And in April the frame went up, and in the evenings after work he smelled of sawdust and effort and was, by his own private assessment, happier than he had been at any previous point in his life. The work was good work, and it was building something for children to grow in, and it was also, in a way he could not fully explain to anyone and did not try to, a thing he was building for her, not because she needed it from him, but because the chance to build something that served what she served was a form of love made material. He asked her to marry him on an April evening when the school frame was half up and visible from the porch, the new building sitting against the sunset sky like a promise in wood and light. He asked her simply, with no elaborate ceremony, because she was a woman who preferred the direct form of things, and because what he was asking was straightforward. Did she want to share her life with his? Was what they had worth making permanent? Did the 2 chairs on this porch represent something she was willing to have stand for the rest of their days? She said yes with the same clarity and conviction she brought to everything, and then she said, "I was wondering when you were going to ask." "I wanted to be sure of the answer," he said. "You could have been sure of the answer since December," she said. "I know," he said. "I am a careful man." "You are a very careful man," she agreed, without indicating whether this was a complaint or a compliment, and the ambiguity was affectionate. And he kissed her on the porch in the April evening, and the new school building's skeleton stood against the darkening sky, and the cottonwood was putting out its first leaves. They were married in June, in the church on the north end of town, on a warm Saturday morning with the whole of Caldwell in attendance, which was to say roughly 200 people given the town's size that year. Eliza wore a dress that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, a deep blue that was neither the pale color of a girl nor the dark color of a matron, but something exactly itself. And she came down the aisle with a composure that was not the composure of someone suppressing emotion, but of someone whose emotion was something she was carrying openly and with intention. Louis stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which fit him better than suits usually fit men who worked with their hands and had the shoulders to prove it. And when he saw her coming toward him, he did not try to order his face into the expression of dignified composure that the occasion probably warranted and simply let it show what he felt, which was everything. The vows were the standard vows of the time and place, which were made for their permanence and not their poetry, But there was a moment in the middle of them when Eliza looked at him with an expression that was so entirely present and so entirely certain that the words became more than their standard meaning and settled into something that would last. Cyrus Dodd cried, which he would deny firmly, and at length to anyone who brought it up afterward. The reception was held in the church hall and then moved outside when the afternoon got warm, and there was the fiddle and the banjo again, the same two cowboys from Christmas, and dancing on the grass, and food that the women of Caldwell had collectively assembled with the same cooperative energy they brought to disasters and celebrations alike. Louis danced with his wife, which was a word he tried inside his head several times throughout the evening, with the delighted disbelief of someone who has been given something extraordinary and is still verifying that it is real. They moved Eliza's things from the boarding house to his house that week, which was their house now, and the rearrangement of space that follows two lives being joined in a single dwelling was accomplished with less friction than might be expected, because both of them had strong preferences that turned out mostly not to conflict. She had books in quantities that required the building of additional shelving, which Louis undertook with enthusiasm. He had a workshop full of things she found interesting rather than intrusive. She cooked with an economy of motion and a willingness to try things that produced some excellent results and some memorable failures that they laughed about. He woke early and went to bed early, which matched her own tendencies in a way that was a practical relief neither of them had thought to consider during the courtship. The new school building was completed in August of 1879, 14 months after Eliza had arrived in Caldwell on the stage from Wichita. It was a proper building with good windows on the east and south walls, a ceiling high enough to breathe in, a separate room for preparation and storage, and a second classroom framed out for eventual use. On the day the building opened for the fall term, Louis stood at the back while Eliza walked the students through it for the first time, watching their faces when they saw the size of it, the realness of it, and he felt a quiet satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of personal achievement and better, because it was the satisfaction of something that would outlast him. The autumn of 1879 had a different texture from the autumn of 1878. It had the texture of a life that has found its form. The two chairs on the porch were both occupied every evening that the weather permitted. Eliza kept her teaching through the full school year with the same intensity and method that had marked her first year, and the school grew, a new student arriving from a family that had moved in from the range, and then another, and enrollment climbed to 31 by November. She was recognized, formally if briefly, at a school board meeting in October as one of the finest teachers the county had produced, which was a recognition she received with characteristic equanimity, and which she told Louis about that evening with the self-aware humor of someone who values the assessment, but is not going to allow it to alter her opinion of herself. Rance Mallory's father, who won the county commissioner race in November, proved to be a more constructive force in local governance than his son's behavior had suggested he might be, and over the course of the winter he and Louis developed a professional relationship that was not warmth but was respect, which in that time and place was its own sufficient currency. Rance himself moved out to the western portion of the family ranch and was seen in town less frequently, which was a development that suited most people without requiring anyone to say so directly. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the first winter they spent as a household, and it had the warmth of winters that are also a foundation, the warmth of two people who have chosen each other, and whose choosing is borne out daily by the ordinary evidence of shared mornings and shared evenings, and the small accumulated knowledge of how another person moves through the world. Louis learned that she liked her coffee strong and her mornings quiet, and that she read in bed before sleep with an intensity that could keep her up past the point of wisdom. She learned that he woke in the very early hours sometimes and could not sleep and went to the workshop, and that the sound of him working in the darkness was something she had come to find comforting rather than disruptive, the sound of someone fully himself. They talked through those winter evenings about things that they had not talked about in the courtship, because the courtship had been too early for them, and now was the right time. They talked about what they wanted, not only in the immediate sense of dinner and spring plans, and whether the back bedroom could use a second window, but in the larger sense, the sense of a life being constructed with the same deliberateness that Louis brought to his buildings. She wanted the school to continue growing and eventually to have a second teacher, so that she could do less of the management and more of the actual teaching, which was the part she cared about. He wanted to take on larger building projects, not because of the money, but because his skills were at a point where smaller work no longer fully used them, and there were buildings in Caldwell that needed to be what they were supposed to be rather than what they currently were. She wanted to travel someday, not to leave but to see other places and bring the seeing back. He wanted to build her a bigger porch, which she said was either a metaphor or a practical statement, and he said it was both. They talked about children, which was a conversation that had a different quality than the others, a combination of wanting and wondering, and the acknowledgement that some things are not entirely in one's own hands. They both wanted children. That was clear and simple. The details were not yet available. Spring of 1880 came with the usual Kansas extravagance, the sky doing impossible things with light and the prairie greening in the south, and the wind bringing the smell of coming warmth. And in April, Eliza told him, in the morning over coffee with the directness that was still and always her most characteristic mode, that she believed she was pregnant. He set down his cup with a care that suggested he was managing the size of his feeling through the mechanism of treating objects gently. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. "Mrs. Peterson confirmed it yesterday." Mrs. Peterson was the closest thing Caldwell had to a physician for matters of this particular kind. He looked at her across the table. She was watching him with the same measuring attention she brought to things she needed to read accurately, checking the temperature of his response. "I am," he said, and then he found that words were temporarily inadequate, and he simply put his hands over hers on the table, and she turned them and held his, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning kitchen, with the spring light coming through the windows. The pregnancy had the quality of a long expectation made beautiful by its visibility. Eliza continued teaching through the summer, which some people thought inadvisable, and she thought was perfectly reasonable given that pregnancy was not an illness, a position she argued so effectively to the school board that they did not push it after the first conversation. She was strong and well, and the work suited her, and Louis watched her through those months with the watchfulness of someone who loves a person enough to worry and trusts them enough to leave the worrying largely to himself. He built things during those months. He built an extension on the back of the house that gave them a proper bedroom large enough for a family, with windows on 2 walls and good ventilation for the summer heat. He built a cradle, which he made with the kind of obsessive care that he had put into the second rocking chair, spending evenings on the joinery, and the finish with a concentration that was both practical and devotional. Eliza came to the workshop one evening and sat on a stool and watched him work for an hour without saying much, and at the end of it she said, "You are going to be a remarkable father," which was not a thing he had thought about in those terms and which settled into him and stayed. In November of 1880, their son was born. He was born on a cold, clear night in the house on the east side of Caldwell, with Mrs. Peterson in attendance and Louis in the outer room trying to maintain a stillness he did not feel. When Mrs. Peterson came out and told him it was done and they were both well and it was a boy, he sat down on the nearest chair, which happened to be a kitchen chair and not one of the porch rockers, and put his head in his hands for a moment, not from grief but from the size of the gratitude. The boy was strong and loud, and had his mother's eyes from the first day. They named him James, after no one in particular, and both of them in the general way of a name that felt right and solid, the way good names should. Eliza, who had approached the subject of motherhood with the same clear-eyed determination she brought to everything, took to it with a naturalness that surprised even her, the way that some people find in the unexpected thing, the thing they were made for. She nursed James with the same focused attention she gave her students, and she slept when he slept with an efficiency of rest that Louis admired. And by the spring, she was back in the classroom, leaving James in the care of a woman named Ruth Carver, who had come to Caldwell from Missouri the previous year, and who had a warmth with children that Eliza recognized and trusted. The school by 1881 had 38 students, and the second classroom was opened and staffed with a young teacher named Henry Pratt from Kansas City, whom Eliza had interviewed twice and drilled on methodology before approving, and who turned out to be both competent and genuinely glad of the chance to learn from someone who knew what she was doing. She managed the expanded school with the same principled efficiency she had always applied, and Louis watched her work from a greater distance now, because he had his own work and she had hers, and they had agreed that maintaining the separateness of the professional from the personal was important to both of them. But the watching when he did watch was still the same, the combination of admiration and deep, uncomplicated love. James grew with the speed that children have in the first years, which always seems impossible to the people watching it and inevitable to everyone else. By the time he was walking, at 13 months, he was already showing the inclination toward getting into things that suggested he was his parents' son in the most complete sense, combining his mother's curiosity with his father's need to understand how things worked by taking them apart. He was a sunny child, easy in himself, with the kind of fundamental contentment that comes from being surrounded by people who want him specifically, and not just generically. Caldwell changed in those years with the change of the Wild West itself. That particular moment in the late 1870s and early 1880s when the frontier was still the frontier, but was visibly becoming something else. The railroads extending, and the cattle trails shifting, and the steady arrival of homesteaders who were building permanent things where temporary things had been. There were aspects of this change that were straightforward improvements and aspects that were more complicated, and Louis and Eliza talked about the complications in the evenings on the porch, with the awareness that they were living in a particular moment of history, and that being aware of it was a form of respect for what it meant. There were families of freed men and women who had come west after the war, some of them settling in communities on the Kansas plains, seeking the space and possibility that the frontier, for all its hardness, offered in a way that the entrenched East did not. Louis had worked alongside some of these men on various building projects, and had found in them the same quality he valued in good workmen everywhere, the combination of skill and seriousness, and pride in the thing being made. The question of how these families were treated in Caldwell was a question that did not have a simple or satisfying answer, as questions of justice rarely do in places where the structures of injustice have been carried west along with everything else. Eliza had students of several different backgrounds in her school, and made it her clear and stated policy that her classroom was organized by age and ability, and nothing else, which was not universally welcomed, but which she maintained with the quiet inflexibility she brought to the things that mattered. There was also the matter of the land and its earlier inhabitants, the tribes whose territory had been the entirety of what was now Kansas, who had been pressed progressively south and west through the reservation system in the years before and after the Civil War. This was a fact of the landscape that the people living in Caldwell carried in different ways, some with indifference and some with discomfort, and a very few with the genuine reckoning that the fact deserved. Louis had thought about it more than most, perhaps because the carpenter's relationship to land was particular, the understanding that building in a place was making a claim on it that had weight. He had never found a way to resolve the thinking into anything that felt like an adequate response, and the honesty of the irresolution was at least that, honest. They talked about these things on the porch in the evenings, he and Eliza, with James asleep inside and the Kansas sky doing its enormous things above the town. And the talking was not comfortable in the way of happy conversation, but was the more important kind of discomfort, the kind that keeps something alive in you that ought to stay alive. It was one of the things that made the partnership of their minds as important to him as the partnership of everything else. In the spring of 1882, Eliza told him she was pregnant again. This time the telling had a different quality, the quality of a thing that is wonderful and also familiar, the difference between astonishment and deep joy. And they received it together with the open hands of people who have learned to hold good things without clutching at them. That summer was full and warm and busy in the way that summers become when a family has a toddler learning to speak in complete sentences, and a mother carrying a pregnancy, and a father with 3 building projects running simultaneously. James, who was a year and a half and already in possession of opinions well in excess of his vocabulary, spent his mornings with Ruth Carver and his afternoons on the porch, or in the workshop depending on where Louis was working that day. He showed an early preference for the workshop, which Louis took as both a flattery and a responsibility, introducing him to tools with the care and seriousness of a man who believes that the right relationship with the objects of work is something that has to be established correctly from the beginning. Eliza taught through July, and then took the last weeks of summer to prepare for the autumn term with the methodical thoroughness that never left her, even with a large pregnancy and a toddler and a husband who, she informed him one August evening with the fond exasperation that had become one of her primary modes with him, was constitutionally incapable of building anything small when there was the option of building something larger. He was building her the bigger porch he had promised. He had started it in June, extending the front porch around the side of the house and adding a section in the back that faced the yard, where a second cottonwood had grown up enough to provide real shade. He had built 2 more rocking chairs for it, because they had only the original 2 and the back section would need seating, and Eliza had teased him about the number of chairs on his porch, approaching a small furniture showroom, which he had accepted as a compliment. The second child was born in October of 1882, a girl this time, coming into the world on an autumn morning, with the October light coming golden through the windows and Mrs. Peterson presiding with her usual capable calm. They named her Clara, after Eliza's mother in Ohio, who had died when Eliza was 19, and whom she spoke of with a love that had not been diminished by the years. Louis wrote to his own mother in Missouri when Clara was born, a letter that was longer than his usual correspondence, because the fact of his daughter made him think about what had been given to him and what he wanted to pass forward, and how the line of a life could contain both damage and repair. James, confronted with Clara, responded with a 2-year-old's version of interested suspicion that gradually became the proprietary love of an older child, so that by the time Clara was crawling he was treating her with a combination of bossy affection and genuine protectiveness that made both his parents laugh and also, on occasion, actively intervene. The years that followed had the quality of a life that knows what it is. They were not years without difficulty, because no years are, and the Wild West in the early 1880s continued to be a place where difficulty was not difficult to find. There were the hard winters that Kansas periodically delivered, the winter of 1883 being particularly severe, with a blizzard in January that closed the school for 2 weeks and left the town's most vulnerable residents in genuine need. Louis helped organize the collection and distribution of firewood and food, which was the kind of practical community work that he did without fanfare and which Eliza, who was doing the same thing from the school's perspective, recognized and valued. There were economic difficulties as the cattle trade shifted, and some of the town's businesses struggled, and 1 or 2 of the families Louis had worked for found themselves unable to pay, which he handled with a patience that was not sentimental but was real. There was the autumn of 1884, when Cyrus Dodd's father Warren died, a sudden death from a heart failure, and Louis spent a week with Cyrus doing the things that need doing when someone's father dies, the practical and the impractical, and the late evenings sitting together saying both nothing and everything. Eliza brought food and sat with Cyrus's mother and did the other half of that work, and the friendship between the Haskins household and Cyrus, who had watched Louis build the second rocking chair and known what it meant before Louis was willing to say it, deepened in that week into something that would last as long as all of them did. James started school in the fall of 1885, in his mother's classroom, which was a situation that gave both of them pause and which they handled by establishing a strict division between the teacher and the mother that James, who was a perceptive child, understood was necessary and largely respected. He was a good student, which was no surprise given the household he had grown up in, with books on every surface and two parents who treated the exchange of ideas as something worth spending the evening on. He was also a child who made friends easily and who had a quality of steadiness, a fundamental okayness in himself, that Louis recognized as the gift of having grown up in a house where the adults were genuinely glad to be there. Clara, who would start school 2 years after James, was a different kind of child, more interior, with a tendency to work things out on paper before she talked about them. She had, from an early age, a gift for drawing that appeared out of nowhere, and then, when you thought about it, appeared out of exactly the right place, because her mother had those botanical illustrations in their leather case on the study shelf and her father could look at a board of wood and see the finished shape it was moving toward. Louis built her a small desk in the workshop one afternoon when she was 4, sized exactly for her, and set it in the corner of his workshop so that she could draw while he worked. And the Saturday mornings they spent in that arrangement, her at her desk with pencil and paper and him at his workbench with whatever he was making, were among the most quietly satisfying times of his life. In 1886, Louis won the contract to build the new county courthouse, which was the largest building project that had come to Caldwell, and was a commission that came partly from his reputation and partly from the commissioner relationship that had developed over the years. It was a significant project, a real building with ambition in its design, and he threw himself into it with the focus that his best work always got, spending evenings with the plans at the kitchen table and occasionally waking Eliza, who had the capacity to sleep through considerable noise, to ask her opinion about a facade detail or a proportional question, and she would look at the drawing with her slightly unfocused, just-woken focus, and then give him an opinion that was, 9 times out of 10, correct. The courthouse took 2 years and was finished in 1888, a building of solid stone and good proportion that sat at the center of Caldwell, with the authority of something built to last. On the day of its completion, Louis stood across the street from it and looked at it with Eliza beside him and James, who was 8, and Clara, who was 6, and the children looked at the building with the particular combination of awe and pride that comes from understanding that their father made the thing they are looking at. James said, "Is it the biggest building you have ever made?" "Yes," Louis said. "Will you make a bigger one?" "Perhaps," Louis said. "I want to make buildings too," James said, with the conviction of someone who has just decided something permanent. Louis looked down at his son. "Then you will," he said. Eliza put her arm through his, and they stood on the street in the October light of 1888 and looked at the courthouse, and at the town around it, the town they had both arrived in separately and made, together, into the place that was home in the fullest sense of the word. The porch on the east side of Caldwell was larger now than it had been in 1878, with the extensions Louis had added over the years, and it held 4 rocking chairs in a row on the front section, and 2 more on the side section that faced the yard. In the evenings when the weather was right, which in Kansas meant the evenings that were not too hot and not too cold and not too windy, which was admittedly a narrower band than you might hope for, the family sat on the porch together. James had his own chair now, a proper-sized one that Louis had built for him the previous birthday, and Clara had a smaller one that she was currently growing into with the speed of someone who had decided to be taller. Louis and Eliza sat in the original two chairs, the first one he had built for himself, and the second one he had built without knowing entirely why, the one that fit her perfectly because he had made it that way. On those evenings, with the children doing their own things and the town going about its ordinary business at the end of the street, and the Kansas sky performing above it all, Louis would sometimes look at the second chair, the one Eliza was sitting in, and think about the September afternoon in 1878 when he had carried it out to the porch and stood looking at it and known, in the way that the self knows things before the mind catches up, that he was waiting for something. Not waiting in the anxious way, but in the way of someone who has prepared a place and trusts that it will be filled. He had not imagined, precisely, Eliza Walker. He had not imagined her directness or her dry wit or her absolute clarity about the things that mattered or the way she looked at the school on a September morning, when the children were coming up the steps, and her face had the expression of someone doing exactly the work they were supposed to do in the world. He had not imagined the particular quality of the evenings they had built together out of coffee and conversation, and the ordinary extraordinary business of two people who have decided that the other person is the best part of the life they are making. He had only known, somehow, that the chair should be there when whoever needed it arrived. The autumn of 1889 was a warm one, and on one of those warm October evenings, Eliza told him she was pregnant again. She told him this on the porch in the chairs, with the lamp light from inside the window casting its warm stripe across the boards, and she told him with the same directness she brought to every important thing, and he received it the same way he had received the first two times, with a feeling too large for words that he managed through the mechanism of being very gentle with everything he touched. James and Clara were told the following morning at breakfast, and James, who was 9 and had acquired the philosophical perspective of a child who has already navigated having a sibling, said that a third child would require another rocking chair on the porch. Louis agreed that it probably would. Clara said she hoped it was a girl. James said he hoped it was a boy. Louis said he hoped it was well and that whoever it was would be exactly who they were supposed to be. Eliza looked at him over the coffee cups in the morning kitchen, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been known, and not diminished by the knowing. The eyes of a woman who has everything she built her life to hold, and has found that the building was worth every careful joint and fitted board of it. The third child was born in May of 1890, in the spring that came to Caldwell with the particular abundance of that year's good rains, the prairie green and extravagant, and the sky above it doing the impossible things it always did. He was a boy, which resolved the wager between James and Clara in James's favor, and they named him Thomas, which was Louis's own middle name and which he had carried without much use for 30-odd years, and was glad to see go somewhere. Thomas was from his first weeks a calm and watchful child, the kind of infant who seemed to be absorbing information at a rate that would have been alarming if it were not also deeply entertaining. He watched his father's hands when Louis held him with an attention that suggested he was already trying to understand the mechanics. He watched his mother's face when she spoke to him with the complete receptivity of a child who has recognized something important. He watched James and Clara with the cautious fascination of someone who has arrived at a party already in progress and is determining the rules. On the evening that Thomas was 3 weeks old, Louis carried him out to the porch and sat in his rocking chair in the warm May evening, and held his son while the town settled into its night sounds, the distant horse in the stable and the wind in the cottonwoods, and somewhere the faint music from the saloon that was always there under everything like a bass note. Eliza came out a few minutes later and sat in her chair, and they rocked together in the May night with the baby between them in Louis's arms, and James and Clara were inside asleep, and the street was quiet, and the stars were out over Kansas in their millions. 3 rocking chairs we will need to build, Louis said. 4, Eliza said. Clara needs one of her own size too. She has outgrown the one she has. 4 chairs, he said. Unless you build more, she said. You have a tendency. I build what is needed, he said. You build what you hope will be needed, she corrected, gently, accurately, which is a different thing and also a better thing. He looked at her in the May evening. She was in his chair, the chair he had made for her before he had the nerve to say it was for her, and she was watching him hold their son with the expression that was the one he loved best on her face, the expression of complete unhurried presence, as if this moment were the only moment and she had chosen to be fully in it. Her hair was down, which it only was in the evenings, and the warm night had the smell of spring in it, and Thomas made a small sound in his arms that was not unhappiness, but was a communication of some kind, the universal communication of the very new, I am here and I am aware and I have arrived. I should have invited you to sit in that chair sooner, Louis said. You invited me when you were ready, Eliza said, and I sat down when I was ready. The timing was right. I spent 3 weeks staring at an empty chair. You spent 3 weeks, she said, building up to something that lasted. That seems like a reasonable investment. He was quiet for a moment, rocking gently, with his son in his arms and his wife beside him and the Kansas night all around them. The flat and enormous landscape of the life they had made here on the border of the frontier, in the town that smelled of dust and ambition and had been, against all probability, exactly the right place. Yes, he said. I suppose it was. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and they rocked together in the quiet of the May evening, and the stars over Caldwell were the same stars that had been there before the town was a town and would be there long after. And under them, a man sat on a porch he had built and held his son, and sat beside the woman who had sat down in a chair he made for her before he had the nerve to say it was made for her, and the whole of it. The town and the school and the courthouse and the children asleep inside and the chairs rocking on the boards had the feeling of something completed, something built with care and fit together well, something that would hold. Thomas grew, and James built things, and Clara drew them, and Eliza taught, and Louis hammered and shaped and planned, and the seasons went through their cycle over the Kansas plains, and on the porch of the house on the east side of Caldwell, there were eventually 4 rocking chairs in a row and then 5, because Louis did have a tendency, and because there was always, in a house like that, the possibility of someone new arriving who would need a place to sit. The last evening of the year 1890, Eliza and Louis sat together on the porch in their original chairs while the children were inside and the new year was an hour away, and the cold was the kind of cold that makes the stars look harder and more permanent, and Eliza said, "We should go in. It is cold." "In a minute," Louis said. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, at the town, at the particular quality of the winter night on a Kansas main street, the lamp light in the windows and the smoke from the chimneys and the distant sound of celebration from the Leland Hotel where the new year was being welcomed. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am thinking that I built a chair for someone I had not yet properly spoken to, and sat across from it being afraid for 3 weeks, and that the whole rest of my life came from sitting still long enough to be ready to invite her to sit down." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "That is either the most or least romantic way you could have put that," she said. "Both," he said. She laughed. The laugh that he had known from the 3rd time he heard it was one of the finest things he would ever hear, direct and warm and entirely her own. "Both," she agreed. And she put her hand out, and he took it, and the chairs rocked on the cold boards, and inside their house their 3 children slept, and the new year came over the plains of Kansas with the wind and the stars, and the 2 chairs on the porch rocked gently together in the cold night air, as they had done since the September afternoon when Louis Haskins had carried one of them out and set it down and known, without quite yet knowing why, that it was waiting for someone who would make everything make sense.